I've got, this presentation will be up on, this presentation has a few charts and graphs in it that may go by quickly. It'll be up on my web tomorrow at bgkeithley.com if you want to follow up and see it there, and there's various explanations of the charts and graphs there as well. So from the standpoint of trying to walk through this, I'm going to talk about where things are now as of this afternoon. There was an update on oil and gas tax credits this afternoon, not particularly good, but there was an update on oil and gas tax credits this afternoon. What are the remaining issues? And then how we resolve the issues and identify a going forward plan, because one of the most important things to come out of this session is a plan that we can articulate to Wall Street and elsewhere about what we're doing with our fiscal situation. Where are we now? Where are things now? I always think about things in terms of revenues and spending. Maybe that's the accounting background a little bit, but I try to, when I think about budget issues, where are we on revenues and where are we on spending? And revenues is an interesting thing. I'm going to spend more time deeper into the discussion about that, but I just want to put you in the place where Juno thinks revenue is right now. And these projections are coming from the various fall and to some degree spring revenue sources book. Twice a year, the Department of Revenue publishes a projection of revenues looking forward. One's in the fall revenue sources book, and then that's updated in the spring revenue sources book before the budget goes final. And to give you a sense of what Juno's thinking, what's driving Juno, let me just step through this quickly. This is about $5.2 billion. This dark line is about $5.2 billion, which is basically the spending line for FY 2016, the year we're in now. Fiscal years run from July 1st to June 30, so we're currently in the 2016 fiscal year. We'll switch over to the 2017 fiscal year on July 1st, this coming July 1st. But this is, just to give a baseline, this is the spending line. And these red, blue, and blocked lines are the revenue projections from the last three fall revenue sources books. So in the fall of 2003, the projection going forward of what revenue was the red line. And the red line was we were going to suffer a little bit of a dip. And this is before the oil price drop. So we were going to suffer a little bit of a dip, and then it was going to come back up around 5.4, and it was going to tail off. But this tail off is never a good projection of where we're going, and I'll talk about that as we go through. So the feeling was we were going to have a little dip. We were going to call on savings and then come back up to the revenue, to the spending line, this sort of spending line, 5.4, 5.2. Fall 2014, this is after the oil price drop in the summer of 2014. The projection was it was going to be a deeper dip, and then it was going to come back up and approach the revenue line. And again, the tail is never a good projection, so there wasn't that much concern about it. Call on savings, fill up this trough, and then get back up to revenue that's coming something approaching what people thought would be a spending line at that time. What's triggered the whole, at least the PFD cut discussion, is this blocked line. And this is the projection that was included last fall in the fall 2015 revenue sources book put out by DOR, and is continued, frankly, probably with a little bit of down dip out here now in the spring 2016 fall revenue sources book. And that's showing no recovery. And so when you're sitting in Juno, and this is what you're told by the Department of Revenue, what you're seeing is a deep drop and a persistent drop in revenue against a spending line, regardless of whether you put it at 5.4, 4.9, 4, 3, wherever you put it, you see a deep spending drop. And that's what's triggered the whole PFD discussion and the tax discussion. This line and the reaction that Juno has had, Juno and others has had to that projection. Now, frankly, I think that's a false projection. And I'm going to talk about why I think that is as we go through this. But that's what's driving the discussion. So in terms of where things are now in Juno, that's what's in Juno's mind, right? That's both in the administration's mind and in the legislator's mind. this is where we are from the spending side. And this is, again, you can see this in detail on the blog if you want to go through it in detail. But this is spending by agency and then by statewide spending. There are three categories of statewide spending: oil and gas credits, debt, payment of debt. We have some long-term debt. We're paying off debt. PERS and TERS contribution, the annual PERS and TERS contribution that's made by the state. And then the capital budget. And in the capital budget, there's always capital, but then the Senate, in its proposed capital budget, has snuck in a little bit of additional operating expenditures as well. So I've included both of those. This is current as of the middle of April. It's current as of both bills, both the House and the Senate, getting their operating budgets put together. It reflects the capital budget that the Senate has put on the floor. It's currently in Senate Finance, hasn't moved to the Senate yet. And it has a couple of adjustments to it. The adjustments are for oil and gas tax credits. Now this is going to be a big part of the discussion about where we are going forward. In the budgets that were passed, remember when everybody said, oh, we aren't going to do anything until we get the budget passed. And once we get the budget passed in the middle of March, then we're going to start worrying about revenue, right? But our budget's going to be fixed. So when the budget's passed, in the House it passed in the early March 9th, and the Senate version was 3 days later, March 12th. The versions that passed then were 4.4. Daniel set the framework, right? We're trying to get to 4.5. That's a long-term sustainable number. I'll explain that a little bit more in a bit. But the Senate passed 4.4. Now they had $100 million of unallocated cuts in there, which was sort of like, we'll get to it. We'll fill in that hole. But with that $100 million, they had a 4.4 budget. And the House had 4.514. The House tried some tricks. As Daniel said, they tried to use PCE funds to fund a portion of the university so it didn't look like unrestricted general funds were being used to fund the university, and so they could count that as a smaller number. They did the same thing with some other funds. They took some school funds and counted that towards something else. But adjusting all that out, getting apples to apples so that we can really talk about real numbers here, adjusting all that out, they were near 4.5, they were a little bit over 4.514. Key to that was they both had, for oil and gas tax credits, they had $73 million. Both of them in the budgets, in the bills that were passed in the middle of March, had $73 million. $73 million is the statutory minimum under the oil and gas tax credit laws, the statutory minimum that has to be offered for oil and gas tax credits. So they both included $73 million. If you go back in the blog, if you go back in stuff that people write, everybody sort of circled that and said, 73 million, that seems a little low. But nonetheless, that's the budget they passed, and they both touted that they got to 4.5, right? All right, fast forward now, as the oil and gas tax credit bill is coming up separately. It's coming up through House Resources, where it got stalled for like a month. And then finally sort of bursts on the scene in April. This is after they passed the budgets, right? After they told us they passed the budgets. Oil and gas tax credit bill bursts on the scene. In the Senate version of oil and gas tax credits is not 73 million, it's 775 million. I'm sorry, that's the House. It's not 73 million, 775 million in the House. In the Senate, it's not 73 million, it's 767 million. So once you adjust to take into account oil and gas tax credits, what they're doing on oil and gas tax credits, or at least what they've done so far, the 4.5 that each body was so proud they got to goes to 5.2. And so now the House sits at, with the oil and gas tax credit bill that came to the floor, didn't get passed on the floor, had people splitting all over the place, but with the bill that's sitting on the House floor, it's back in rules now. The House now has a budget of 5.2 billion, and the Senate now has a budget of 5.1 billion. So that's where spending is right now. We're significantly above the 4.5. All right, so what are the issues going forward? Why are they still sitting in Juneau? What are they worrying about? What's yet to get resolved before they come home? Three things. Oil and gas tax credits, big issue. We'll talk about that in a bit, more in a bit. The operating and capital budget, they still haven't passed the final operating budget, right? They passed the versions in March, but those were different versions in each body. They have to be reconciled, they have to go to a conference committee, and they have to come out and then be approved by both bodies. and they're going to have to absorb oil and gas tax credits. Whatever the heck finally is done on oil and gas tax credits is going to have to be reflected in those two bills. And then PFD cuts and taxes. We've all heard about the conversation about cutting PFDs down to $1,000. The governor's insistence on going to taxes, that's still sitting out there. So frankly, from a fiscal policy standpoint, three huge issues are still sitting out there. Oil and gas tax credits is a problem. And I'm going to talk more about the solution in a minute. But just to lay the groundwork, we're not talking about one number. We're not talking about choking down 700 million or 750 million this year, and then it ends, and then we can go on and talk about other things. We're talking about a program that the way it currently sits in the statute has a very long life. These are projections from the Spring Revenue Sources book, and frankly, again, the tail end of these projections are low. If you would have looked back 3 years, 4 years, at what the projections for the oil and gas tax credits would have been in these years, it would have been about $250 million. What's happening, what's really interesting, I live mostly in the oil and gas world. What's really interesting is, and I have friends in New York, investment bankers, Alaska is being looked at as the place to put your money from a global perspective because we are doing oil and gas tax credits. Nobody else globally does oil and gas tax credits. So as we've had this downtick in global investment, as oil prices have gone down, we've had this downtick in global investment. More investment on a percentage basis has come to Alaska to take advantage of the oil and gas tax credits. Why? Because you only have to put down about 15% to 35% of your costs of drilling. The state, under the oil and gas tax credits, the state picks up the remaining 65% to 85%. So in terms of a place to put your money, and you don't have to give up any ownership. I mean, you get these credits and you don't have to give up any ownership. It's sort of like free money. So in terms of a place to put your money, everybody sort of figured out, hey, Alaska's a nice place. Yeah, I may not find oil, but boy, you know, if I only have to put 15% of my money down to go searching for oil, that's a pretty good deal. And if I strike it, it's all mine. So what's happened is as oil prices have gone down, as investment opportunities globally have slacked off because the economics aren't there, there's been more and more money coming into Alaska. And more money has been qualifying for these oil and gas tax credits. So, in 2017, this is from the Spring Revenue Sources book. The projection is 775 million, 500 million, 375 million in 2019, 275 million, 270 million in 2020, and then they sort of lock in on this 250 million number. But let me tell you, if we don't change the law, what's going to happen is we're going to stay at these fairly high numbers because more and more money is going to keep coming on in as we go forward. These are the effects of the two bills, the two tax bills that are out there so far, the Senate bill and the House bill. The House bill is the one that went through House Resources, House Finance, and is stuck now on the House floor. Can't get 21 votes to go anyplace. This is the effect under the revisions, the reform of the oil and gas tax credit law under each of these bills. The House bill doesn't change it at all. For fiscal year 2017, we still owe $775 million in oil and gas tax credits in 2017. The reform begins in 2018, and it reduces the $500 million by $37 million down to $463 million. In 2019, reduces the 375 by 60 down to 315 million. In 2020, the 270 million by 55 down to the 215 million. So we still have huge obligations going forward, even under the reform package. The Senate is slightly better in terms of the reductions: 58 versus 37, 78 versus 60, 73 versus 55. Still doesn't do anything significant in 2017, so we're still at 775 plus or 770 million plus or minus in 2017. Some slight reductions under the Senate version, but we still have a category of spending that at least is the third largest in state government, if not the second largest. If we continue to get an influx of investment, it ends up being the second largest, higher than Medicaid, that we're spending on oil and gas tax credits. And again, you can see the impact. If you take the current budget and then you adjust it for oil and gas, it blows total spending up to $5.2 billion, and then the Senate budget blows it up to $5.1 billion. So the reform bills that have been in the legislature so far are not significantly changing the dynamic of oil and gas tax credits. They still are at a very high level. Again, this is still part of where we are. I'll talk about a solution to that. The operating and capital budgets going forward, the way I measure them is the bottom line. A lot of people get involved in the detail. I know some of you are involved in this effort. I'll just mention it. There's this huge effort, huge brouhaha going on now about reducing merit pay raises for state employees, trying to cut those merit pay raises, $30 million. That's what the fiscal note is on freezing merit pay raises. So yeah, we can talk about that, but that's not going to get $5.2 billion. It's not going to get $5.2 billion back down to 4.5. Frankly, some of this stuff is misdirection. It's like, yeah, these are conservative principles. Go chase that bone, right? And miss the big picture that spending is still staying high. And so when we talk about, oh, let's go after DHS&S, or let's go after K through 12, or let's go after this, or let's go after that, those are the things we ought to be focusing on. We're missing the bottom line. So my suggestion, when you think about these issues, is look at the bottom line. Don't get distracted by the pieces that are moving around in the various categories. Look at the bottom line. And the bottom line is changing significantly from the $4.5 billion that Daniel talked about to levels significantly higher. All right, PFD cuts and taxes. Now this is an issue, and again, this is sort of how I think about it as we go into the solutions, as we start down the solutions. PFD cuts and taxes are an interesting phenomenon. Some will argue that the economic effect of PFD cuts and taxes aren't that big. Because yes, you're taking $1 out of the private economy and you're moving it over to the government economy. Rick's going to have less money, but the government's going to have more money, and the government's going to spend it in the economy. So they will argue the economic effect is zero, right? It's a zero-sum game. It's not, from the standpoint of the overall economy, it doesn't matter whether it's spent in the private economy or the government economy. It's still spent, and it still helps the Alaska economy. That's wrong.
I agree.
The ICER analysis, well, ICER agrees with you then.
No, I agree with you.
The ICER analysis, the Institute of Social and Economic Research did a full study on this, right? That was one of the big things that the legislature supposedly was waiting on. And their conclusion is it depends on where you spend the dollars. If you spend the dollars through the PFD, it largely stays in Alaska. It circulates in Alaska. And the economic effect of $1 given or $1 transferred to individuals through the PFD is 1.49 times. It has a ripple effect of 1.49 times in the economy before it finally leaves Alaska, right? So $1 spent through the PFD has that positive effect. $1 spent through the capital budget, on the other hand, a large part of that dollar goes outside the state almost immediately. Think about capital budgets. Capital budgets are for building capital items. What are capital items? Steel, concrete, materials. A lot of that dollar, this is the ICER analysis, this isn't me, a lot of that dollar goes outside the state. In fact, 64% of the dollar stays in the state. 36% of the dollar immediately goes outside the state. So if you take $1 out of the PFD, which is going to bounce around and generate 1.49 times the economic effect inside the state, and you give it over to the government and they spend it through the capital budget, there's a huge economic difference. From the standpoint of Alaska income, which, as we're entering a recession, is really what we ought to be very focused on. How much income are Alaskans going to get? So it's not just $1 spent here is fine, is the same as $1 spent there. There are huge differences between where the dollars are spent. I did an analysis of the McKinnon-Thompson plan. Now, this is a bill introduced by Senator McKinnon a couple of weeks ago on a Monday that was supposed to be the breakthrough in the whole PFD discussion, and then quickly mimicked by Representative Thompson in the House Finance Committee, and took a view of what the economic impact on Alaska incomes was going to be of that bill. That bill cut the permanent fund dividend from roughly $2,000 plus or minus down to $1,000, right? Took roughly $750 million in gross of what the permanent fund dividend would have injected into the Alaska and moved it over to the government. And so I did a quick analysis of what the economic impact was. If those dollars, it's $800 million, if those dollars stayed in Alaska, that would produce $1.2 billion worth of income to Alaskans as those dollars bounced around the state. As you spent them, the guy you spent them with spent them down in Alaska. As they bounced around the state, they would produce $1.2 billion of overall income. By giving it to the government, by transferring that $1,000 to the government, if it goes out like a capital budget, and frankly, oil and gas tax credits look a lot like capital budgets, because a lot of those dollars are spent outside Alaska on drilling rigs, drilling materials, cement, all sorts of things, chemicals, all sorts of things that you have to do in the development of an oil and gas project. If they're spent like a capital budget, only roughly $500 million of that will stay in the state as income. Of that $800 million transferred out, only $500 million will stay in the state. If you assume that half goes for capital-like items and half goes for other items like government salaries or government employees, then the effect is lower, but still, of that $800 million, only it's going to generate $900 million of income, less than the 1.2 if it goes in as a PFD. So the economic effect on Alaska incomes from taking the PFD, taking that portion of the PFD, $800 million of PFD money, and transferring it to the government is to hurt Alaska's overall economy by about $700 million if it goes to oil and gas tax credits or it goes to capital-like items, and $300 million if it's more broad-based, if half of it goes to capital items and half of it goes to wages and salaries and stuff like that. That's the proposal that Senator McKinnon and Representative Thompson have put on the table. Why? Because it bails out the government economy. The government economy gets another, $800 million to help support the government. And so the government economy is better off if you're a government employee, or if you're a government contractor, or if you're dependent on government contracts like, some telecommunications companies in the state, or oil and gas companies that are dependent on oil and gas credits. It helps them, but it hurts overall Alaska income by $700 million, somewhere between $300 million and $700 million. So just keep that in mind with respect to PFD cuts and taxes. So, going forward, what's the resolution of these issues, these big three issues that sit out here at the end? First, before you can really understand how to resolve these issues, you need to understand revenue, right? You need to understand what the spending side needs to look like. And there's two ways to do that. One is the approach that Juneau's focused on, which is, oh my God, we've got this huge deficit that we have to fill somehow, ad infinitum, so we need to enact permanent PFD cuts and all that sort of thing in order to fill this in. The other is the approach that Scott Goldsmith of the Institute of Social and Economic Research has been talking about since 2010. And the basics of that are this. Alaska is a commodity economy. It's based on oil. Oil prices go up, oil prices go down. Oil prices go up, oil prices go down. Historically, Alaska's tried to follow that, right? We've spent a lot when oil prices have been up. When we ran out of ideas, we did things like, astroturfing every football field in Anchorage, building new UAA athletic arenas, building 2 new engineering buildings, building a state-of-the-art baseball field in Sitka, and building an aquatic center out in Bethel that has to be air-conditioned 24/7, 365, or otherwise it would melt into the tundra. Those are the types that, when we had that money, my God, we had to spend it. So we spent it on things like this, like that. Then oil prices go down, revenues go down, and people go, oh my God, now we have to cut to the bone, or now we have to go out, we have to do PFD raids, or we have to do taxes in order to fill this hole out there. And then oil prices go back up again. And so why have we had to do PFD raids and taxes in the meantime? What the Goldsmith approach does is try to look through all of these cycles, these commodity cycles, and say, yes, oil prices go up. Yes, they go down. Yes, they come back up. And yes, Alaska has new revenue opportunities like the LNG project, a few years out, granted, but it's a new revenue opportunity that's out there on the horizon. rather than try to follow this curve with state spending, spend everything we can when prices are high, and then cut to the bone and start taxing everybody when prices are low, let's try to look through all these cycles, get a smooth line that says, all right, sometimes revenues are going to be higher, we need to save during those times. Sometimes revenues are going to be low, we need to use the savings to support that spending level. Then revenues are going to be high, we need to backfill the savings that we use, we need to build savings for the next cycle. And if you make reasonable projections of where projects are going to go, where oil prices are going to go, where oil production is going to go, you can calculate what that smooth line is and what the so-called sustainable spending line is. It's the line which, if you spend at that level, you can continue spending at that level, adjusted for inflation and population growth, going forward. But when you have high revenues, you need to save above that line. You need to put it into savings, and then you use those savings when you're below that line. The current calculation of that line is about $4.5 billion. It says, yes, we're in a low revenue cycle now, but we're going to come into a higher revenue cycle. Let's not panic. Let's stay at 4.5. Let's fill it with savings, and then when we get above 4.5, we need to save beyond savings. And so the revenue line, the sustainable revenue line that a lot of us look to when we talk about these things is not this revenue line, which is like a projection of we're always going to stay in low prices, right? It's never going to change. The corollary was this, back in 2010, there was a line that went like this, right? We're always going to have high oil prices, it's never going to change, it's going to go to $120, $140, $150, $300, and so we're always going to have high prices. Now we're doing the exact reverse of that, we're always going to have low prices. Rather than do that, the line I look at, that economists look at, is what's the sustainable revenue line that we ought to be focused on? What should we be trying to hold our spending to now? What should we be looking at filling from savings to consider now? So the right number depends on your assumptions, and I'll explain these in a minute, but using $80 a barrel by 2020, which is a reasonable price, I'll talk about that in a moment, a 3% production decline curve as opposed to a 5% production decline curve, which is what the administration's been using. We assume there's going to be new oil. We assume Alaska LNG succeeds. We assume we use earnings from the permanent fund, not the permanent fund itself, but the excess earnings remaining after the dividend to help support government, which is what all the way back to Governor Hammond, which is what the intent was of those earnings. If we use those, and because this line is calculated, adjusted for inflation and population growth, so that the number out in 2050 is the same per Alaskan as the number is right now, so we're trying to keep this constant per Alaskan, you have to estimate population growth. And if you use 5% population, or 0.5%, 0.5% population growth, as opposed to percent population growth, then the long-term sustainable revenue level, the line we ought to be looking at as our baseline for calculating the budget, is $4.3 billion. It's not the $2 billion, not the $1.5 billion. You hear those in Juneau talking about and panicking, and now we have to fill that. It's $4.3 billion. What that means is it's a huge difference. Those in Juneau who built the baseball stadiums in Sitka, who built the AstroTurf football fields, who built the aquatic centers in Bethel, who built the 2 engineering buildings, the list goes on and on. Those in Juneau are going, oh my God, we have to panic. We have to keep these revenues going on a current basis.
You need a chair?
They run to the other. These are the people who said, oh, we got high oil prices forever, we can spend on all this stuff, are now running to the other side of the boat and saying, oh my God, we got low oil prices forever, now we have to tax and we have to cut the PFDs to fill that. Instead of that running from one side of the boat to the other, you've got a situation where you can rely on a constant number fill when you're below that and save when you're above that. So that creates a long-term outlook. At high prices, it cuts away from the situation we've been in. High prices, we're too optimistic. Current spending overshoots the mark. It cuts away from pessimism, where we're now talking about PFD cuts. Creates a long-term financial outlook. So that's the number that we've been using. Some people will say at this point, okay, so you used $80 a barrel, and you assumed LNG, and you assumed oil decline at 3%. What if you did some of this stuff What if Alaska LNG, instead of you giving it a 100% chance, you gave it a 75% chance, or it was going to be delayed by, a significant amount of time, or 50% chance, or 20. You can do all these calculations. What if you use oil at $70 or $60 as opposed to $80? You can do all these calculations. But what you need to do is focus on what the likely best case is, the most reasonable, the most responsible case is in calculating the number. Crude prices, if you tried to stick with crude, this is the array of crude prices from the EIA, from the World Bank, from the IMF, most of the major agencies that predict crude prices, and you can see that there are an array. You need to pick the best from the array, the most reasonable from the array, to do the calculation. We've done that. Scott's done that. I've done that. Using the best available information, we get to the 4.3 number, right? Oil, $80 by 2020. What's the basis for that? The International Energy Agency, and I can do a long talk on this if anybody wants to be bored to death, but the International Energy Agency, which in my opinion is the best at forecasting these types of numbers, they have great supply models, great demand models, great marginal cost of supply models. They say, this is in November of last year, process of adjustment in the oil market is rarely a smooth one, but in our central scenario, the market rebalances at $80 by 2020 with further increases in price thereafter. They haven't moved off that prediction, by the way. And again, in another long speech, I can tell you why they haven't, why you can see this sort of price response occurring in this sort of time frame. There's one article that I posted a couple of days ago on the blog that said we could be at $85 by November of this year. What that does is go in and says, all right, supply and demand's getting tight. We can already see it's getting tight. What's happened is there's been a huge underinvestment in the world in exploration and production, huge underinvestment in the things that lead to oil and gas production. Supply is going down, demand's staying relatively constant in its growth. China has come down some, India's come up. Demand's staying relatively constant. You can see a supply-demand gap forming out there. What that article said was, if we have a supply disruption, if there's an attack in Saudi, if there's an attack in Kuwait, if there's an attack in one of the major oil supply areas, then we could have a price spike early. Otherwise, we're still on track to get to $80 by 2020. And an increasing number of analysts are repeating this view that we're at $80. So in the model, rather than do what the administration's done and said, oh, it's going to stay low forever, we've used $80. Production decline of 3%. One of the most revealing things during this past session was a statement made by Craig Richards, who's the Attorney General, when he was trying to defend a piece of the governor's plan. And he said, Repsol and Armstrong have said that a particular project could yield up to 120,000 barrels a day. That estimated rate is not unreasonable based on details that have been published about the project. Mark Myers confirmed that. Mark Myers, not known as a friend of the industry, but has looked at the data, has confirmed that 120,000 barrels a day. Current TAPS production, current flow through TAPS is about 500,000 barrels a day. That's a 20% increase. That one project could be a 20% increase in the flow in TAPS. There are projects out there that can have can result in additional production. So a 3% production decline curve as opposed to the 5% the administration's assumed, I think is very reasonable. And LNG, you have to understand in the oil and gas industry, this is a historic time. Virtually every company, including Exxon, has cut back to the bone in terms of capital investment. There is not a capital dollar going out there in the entire industry that is not going to a project that those who are spending the dollars think is a likely successful, a project of likely success. ConocoPhillips, Exxon, and BP are still spending capital dollars on the Alaska LNG. I know you can listen to a lot of people say, oh, LNG is never going to happen, the price is too low, we're going to be beat by Australia, we're going to be beat by the Gulf Coast of the United States, we're going to be by, just pick your target. But these three guys, the most sophisticated investors in the LNG world, the most sophisticated investors in oil and gas projects, the ones who are cutting capital projects to the bone, are still spending capital dollars on the Alaska LNG project. Now maybe they stop at some point. In that event, we need to retool. But why do we need to retool and say that we need to talk about taxes and PFD cuts while these guys are still spending on a project that could help us avoid taxes and PFD cuts. So use the best information. I've used oil at 80, production 3%. I've included LNG. And so that's the revenue number. The 4.3 is the revenue number I keep in mind. I don't go to the panic of, oh my God, we only got 1.2 billion. We're only going to have 1.2 billion forever. And so we got to fill this hole with PFD cuts and taxes. I don't do that. Using this model, looking through the commodity cycles, I use 4.3 as my guideline. So we can get to 4.3, right? I walked you through what the House and the Senate had done in terms of their budgets before we got to oil and gas tax credits. House was at 4.514, Senate was at 4.4. They were in the range, right? And over the course of next year or the year after that, we would be at the sustainable budget number long term. The thing that breaks it, the thing that if we have to do PFD cuts and taxes, the thing that's going to cause it are the oil and gas tax credits. This is from the this is a bad problem. This is from the administration's description of their initial House bill, which frankly I support. I don't support the administration often, but I support them on this bill, and I'll explain why in a second. Their provision said we're going to stop this program at July 1, 2016, right? We're going to honor what's happened up to this point. We're going to honor the investments that have been made. We're going to pay off the credits that can be cashed for investments made to be up to the end of this fiscal year, but we're going to stop it at July 1, 2016. Even then, even if you stop the credit program at July 1, 2016, there are still credits that are going to come in from investments that were made before July 1, 2016, right? People are still going to be coming to the state and say, hey, I made this expenditure, this investment before July 1, 2016. I want to cash it in. And under the laws that existed up until July 1, 2016, in the administration's view, they have the right to do that. That's what the law provides. Either that or we try to walk on our obligations, and believe me, we don't want to do that. The bond ratings, the credit market reaction to that would be very bad. So the administration said, we're going to, nice program, we're going to stop it at July 1, 2016. We'll pay off what's due before then. Guess how much is due from the program, even if you stop it at July 1, 2016? There's $700 million still coming in from FY that's been incurred during FY 2016, or they'll come in during FY 2016. There's $425 million that'll show up in FY 2017 that was incurred before the July 1 cutoff. And because of the way the accounting and the cycles work, there will still be about $200 million showing up in FY 2018 from obligations incurred before fiscal year 2016. That all totals up to about $825 million. That's what's still out there, even if we stop the program at July 1, 2016. So there's a big, this were a snake, that'd be a big rat or a big rabbit that you're trying to swallow, right? That's a big thing. Allowing the credits to continue, as both the reform bills, quote, reform bills do, only makes it worse. You incur another $500 million. If you keep it going, you incur another $775 million in 2017. You incur another $500 million in 2018. Another $375 goes on and on and on. Even if you cut it a little bit by what the quote reform bills have done so far, they're still substantial numbers. So it's not just the $800 million you got coming at you from the stuff that's been incurred up until now. It's this additional stuff that's going to start showing up that we're going to have to pay. We're not getting to $4.5 billion. We're not getting to a sustainable budget if we have to swallow this stuff. So there was a development today. This afternoon, House Rules, which is where the House version of the oil and gas credit bill has gone, because they couldn't get it passed on the floor. They put it back to House Rules. There was a draft floated today of a House Rules proposal that is supposedly an improvement on the reform bills that had been on the floor from House Finance and from Senate Finance. Not even close. You know, it ends the program in 2020. I mean, they think that's a big give because the program is otherwise going to continue forever, right? So now they're going to end it in 2020. There's not even a phase down though. So the obligation, there's no cut in the obligation for FY 2017. It's still $775 million. There's a slight cut for FY 2018. There is a cut in 2019 and there is a cut in 2020. But by then we will have incurred something like $1.5 billion more by keeping the program going at this pace. So the House rules proposal, which is supposed to be the compromise that will finally get everybody on board, isn't solving this problem. It's not getting us to 4.5. In my view, the administration has this one right. There needs to be, this program needs to end in 2016. I think the administration said it needs to end in the fiscal year 20. We need to get down to this program. We need to end it in 2016. But given what rules did today as their proposed compromise and the discussions I had later this afternoon, I'm not sure the legislature is going to end the program in 2016 the way it sits right now. You want something to lobby on, I wouldn't worry a whole lot about merit pay raises, $30 million. I'd worry about this sucker, because this is the one that will keep us going over $4.5 billion long into the future. All right, the operating and capital budget. Bottom line, I mean, the test I use about whether we're going to have a solution is whether we get to 4.5 billion. I never wanted to talk about this before, but given where we are with oil and gas tax credits, I think I need to. If we end up over 4.5 billion, which is now, given where the tax credit, the oil and gas tax credits sit, if we end up over 4.5 billion spending, we're going to need to think about supplemental revenues, either taxes or PFD cuts, in order to fund that difference. Because we're going over the sustainable level, right? We're stealing from the future. We're taking money out of savings to fund current spending that isn't rightfully ours. It's what needs to be saved to have a sustainable level in the future. If we're going to do that, then this generation should fund it. This generation shouldn't be stealing from the future in order to fund it. So if we end up over $4.5 billion, this generation is going to need to bear any, in my opinion, is going to need to bear any excess through supplemental revenues. Daniel's never seen this before. I've never discussed it before because I thought surely they were going to get oil and gas tax credits under control. It doesn't appear to be the case.
We're lighting the torches.
PFD cuts and taxes. As I talked about before, this is as much an overall Alaska economy issue as a budget issue. Cutting the PFD or imposing taxes improves the government economy, but at the expense of the overall economy. I defy you to point to a piece of testimony in front of either the Senate Finance or House Finance that talks about that. That talks about the impact on the overall economy of cutting the PFD and taxes. There isn't one. It's all about, oh, government needs this to keep on spending, to keep spending levels at a certain level. That's what the testimony is. And so the reaction is, oh, well, then we need to cut PFD in order to do taxes, in order to keep revenues at that level. There isn't a piece of testimony that talks about the impact on the overall Alaska economy. So to me, PFD cuts and taxes are not as much a government revenue discussion as they are an Alaska economy issue. Are we going to hurt the Alaska, are we going to help the Alaska economy by keeping the money in the hands of where it does the best, generates the most income? Or are we going to put that money in the hands where it doesn't do as much good and in fact hurts the overall Alaska economy? That's what that debate is to me. And that's not been a debate, frankly, that I've heard a lot of discussion about. But as I said before, we're going to have to talk about this. If we're going to go over 4.5 billion, we're going to have to talk about supplemental revenues in order to avoid shifting the burden to future generations if the spending isn't reduced to long-term sustainable levels. But here's my caveats on that. If we get to this point, it should only last as long as we're above 4.5 billion. It only should be the amount that we're above 4.5 billion. It should be done in the manner that has the least damage to the economy, as opposed to pulling it out of the PFD. We should look at other ways to raise that revenue that have less impact on the overall economy. Frankly, sales taxes is one of those. We haven't approached having anywhere near this level of discussion about what's the right thing for the Alaska economy, what's the right amount, what's the right long-term revenue level that we ought to be looking at and have increment and taxing or having supplemental revenues above. We haven't had anywhere near that level of discussion yet. So when we talk, but yet we have people talking about permanent PFD fixes, right? We're going to have a permanent cut to your PFD down to $1,000. We're going to permanently damage the Alaska economy by moving PFD money over to the government sector. We're going to permanently do that as a fix to the solution. Well, if you think that the revenue level is always going to stay at $1.5 billion, yeah, okay, maybe. But it's not. And we've not had the discussion about the fact it isn't, and the fact we only ought to be worrying about that increment of spending, if we have to have spending above the 4.5, only funding that increment above spending 4.5. Frankly, all of that discussion and what's going on today with the oil and gas tax credits makes me think that Representative Kurt Olson's temporary PFD tax, I don't know how many of you might have seen that, but Kurt Olson proposed a couple of weeks ago that we temporarily cut the PFD in order to fund whatever we needed to fund, that we temporarily cut the PFD in order to do that, and then it came off after we'd handled that. Now, some people are shaking their heads like, yeah, the government will never give that up once they get it. Maybe that's right, but if oil and gas tax credits stay at this level, we're going to have to do something. PFD, Kurt Olson's proposal was 4 years, 30% cut, 30% tax. Frankly, that's just 30% is just about, if you have oil and gas tax credits at $500 million and you have a sustainable budget number of $4.5 billion, you need to raise $500 million in supplemental revenue. That's about 30% of the PFD amount. So I don't know if he was prescient or Chanel told him what the right number was, but somewhere in there, that's been the proposal, and maybe that's what we end up talking about in the next few weeks. Going forward plan, we need to go to a sustainable budget level. We need to set spending limits at what the sustainable budget amount is. And when we get back, when we're in this low cycle, we need to continue to look to savings to fill us up to the 4.5 or 4.3. When we get back to a point, and if LNG comes in, when we get back to a point where we have revenues over 4.5, no more baseball stadiums in Sitka, no more AstroTurf football fields, no more double engineering buildings, we put a cap on spending and have a long-term plan not to put ourselves in this fix again as we've done over the last several years. That needs to be the going forward plan. The going forward plan, and when you look at, I did a cash flow analysis the other day, if we limit spending to 4.5, it's a sustainable number. This is 4.5 escalated, actually the number is 4.3, but escalated by inflation and population growth. You can get what the spending line is. You can see what your current revenues are from oil going up to $80 a barrel by 2020, and you can look at what the impact is. If we can get spending down to this level, and if oil prices and production go in the way that people outside of Juneau forecast, we have enough savings to get us through the next 5 years. In fact, we have enough savings to get us to LNG and to the beginning of LNG. It's not 3 years and we're out, right? What you hear from GCI and others. Oh, excuse me, that telecommunications company. It's not 3 years and out. It is, we have enough savings. If we can get spending down, we have enough savings to be able to do it. Yes, ma'am.
How many of our legislators have heard this?
Well,
100%.
a lot of them have heard it. But they've not heard it in formal committee meetings because neither of the co-chairs of House Finance or Senate Finance wanted to be presented in a committee base. A lot of the senators and representatives look at the blog, they read Daniel's stuff, they see these slide decks. I had a conversation with one today that was quoting the numbers, one of the members of the leadership of the House that was quoting these numbers almost exactly. They know these numbers. They know what they're doing with oil and gas tax credits. Let me finish this. We need to codify the approach, right? We didn't codify it in the past, and so when we had money that came in and went into our pockets, we spent it on those things. And so we didn't have the savings that we needed to sustain a higher level of budget. We also need to codify it to respond to S&P. Most of you will recall that in January of this year, S&P downgraded the state's debt slightly, and said that they likely would continue to do it unless we developed a plan that put us on a glide path to a sustainable fiscal structure. The sustainable budget approach would do that. The administration is trying to do it a different way by taking PFDs and doing imposing taxes. But this would put us on the glide path to a fiscal structure. But we need to codify it. We need to have it in law that this is what we're going to do. So it's not another trust me situation, right? Trust me that I'm not going to build another Bethel Aquatic Center. Trust me, I'm not going to build another baseball stadium. I'm not going to work this time. We have to codify it. We have to have that spending level. So in conclusion, Alaska is at a significant crossroads with consequences to both the government and the overall economy. Don't forget the overall economy. This is much more about the overall economy. Should be much more about the overall economy than about the government economy. I changed this bullet this afternoon. I got to admit, I'm sort of depressed about where we are on spending levels because of what House Rules did. the proposed compromise on oil and gas tax credits. We may not get to 4.5 billion this year. We should. They promised in March. We were. They issued budgets in March when they said, we're done with the budgets, now we're going to go to revenue. When they issued the budgets, we were. And now, somewhat at the 11th hour with oil and gas tax credits popping back up, we're not. And it's a question about whether or not we can get those oil and gas tax credits down. If you want a cause, I know it's going to stick in the craw of some of you, but if you want a cause, support the governor's proposal, initial proposal on oil and gas tax credits. That ends it in FY 2016, has a transition fund, gets us out of this hole. What the Republicans have been doing in both the Senate and the House doesn't. We should come in close, resolve as many issues as we can. We should set a near-term end to oil and gas tax credits. We should, if it's not FY 2016, then FY 2017, FY 2018, at least start ramping it down in FY 2017 as opposed to not doing anything in 2017. We need to get closer and closer to the sustainable budget number. Use the least harmful supplemental revenue source. Remember, taking $1 from the PFD has a negative impact on the Alaska economy. Find sources like sales taxes that have a lower impact on the overall Alaska economy in transferring money to the government. Make the PFD cuts and taxes, if necessary, a one-year fix to fix the problem that's been created by not getting oil and gas tax credits down, to fix the problem of not getting to 4.5 this year, until Alaskans have thought through the consequences to the overall economy. These permanent PFD fixes, they're bad. So under the permanent PFD, this is what at least some in Walker administration are saying, right? They know the revenue number is wrong. They know their projection of continued low revenue is wrong. But when they make it as a tactic to argue for getting PFD cuts and taxes, right? So when the oil revenue number recovers, they'll have the PFD revenues, they'll have these PFD cuts, they'll have the PFD revenues, they'll have taxes, and spending can go back up.
Yep.
That's what's going on. So when they talk about permanent PFD cuts and permanent taxes, just start going, no, Mike's good at this. Just start going, no, shouting at them. Because that's, I mean, you're permanently harming the Alaska economy, overall Alaska income, permanently. You've made a permanent decision to hurt Alaska incomes in favor of making the government better.
Right.
That's all you've done. So if we've got to go to supplemental revenues, if we can't fix oil and gas tax credits, then make the PFD cuts taxes a one-year fix, and then let's continue having this discussion about Alaskans. Let's talk about the fact, let's try to have hearings on the fact that taking money from the PFD and putting it over into government reduces Alaska overall income, doesn't benefit Alaska overall income. Takeaways, oil and gas tax credits, right? Everybody got the message on oil and gas tax credits? Bad. Secondly, permanent PFD cuts? Bad. Third, what's the sustainable budget number? 3.5 doesn't matter. I'll accept $200 million. I'll accept $200 million. That's the revenue number we ought to be looking at. Thank you, and I'll do questions if anybody has any. All right, Nick, you go first.
All right. So tell me if this is the way you see it. Okay. It seems to me that if you make the PFD tax cuts permanent, that in the long run, when oil does recover, you've just basically taken the pressure off of the oil companies to be taxed, because now we've got revenue coming in from PFDs permanently that would have been distributed, and now there's less pressure to tax oil companies. Is that what you see?
Well, that might be your uncle's view of it.
That's a question.
No, I think oil taxes are entirely different. Oil taxes are a question of what do we need to do in order to get as much revenue as we can without harming our competitive situation. And that's a calculus that I think goes on differently. That went on. These aren't SB 21 tax credits, by the way. These tax credits have existed back since ACES. And I can explain the history of them if you want in the Cookie-Nut Recovery Act. Was part of them, but these aren't SB 21. I think oil rates are different than what's going on here. So I wouldn't think about it that way. Yep.
Hi, Brad Keithley. To your point of tax credits, had a conversation at the door of the office with an engineer for Hillcorp,
For who?
for Hillcorp,
Okay.
and I asked him, I figured tax credits. So what do you guys think of tax credits? How's it going to affect you? His feedback was, we don't care about tax credits. It's nothing but a large bonus check when they come in. It doesn't dictate where we drill a hole. That was stunning. But
I work at Hillcorp and
Uh-uh.
I do some permitting.
I'm telling you,
Okay.
that's what we said. I know it's being lied to, but that was exactly what we said.
So you tell Gretchen the guy's name.
No, I think I know. That's okay.
Yeah, and so what tax credits are doing at the margin is they're attracting money to Alaska, really risk money, right? I can come in, I can put 15% of my dollars in, I get 85% reimbursed by Alaska. So that's going to attract dollars at 15% to Alaska that otherwise might go elsewhere. If I had to put 100% of my dollars in, I might put that money in the Gulf of Mexico, or I might put it somewhere in the lower 48 rather than put it into Alaska. And so it's attracting marginal investments to Alaska. But the question is whether they're productive and whether we
Right.
can afford them, right? And when you look at the $3 billion that's been spent in tax credits since 2007, since they were initiated, we haven't even recovered the $3 billion to the state treasury, much less produce a return on that $3 billion to the state treasury. And we no longer can afford them. So yes, they are attracting marginal dollars to Alaska, notwithstanding your guy at the door. They're attracting some marginal investment dollars to Hillcorp that Hillcorp's been putting into Alaska. But it's not benefiting the state. It's not producing a return to the state treasury. It's helping out a few service companies on the Kenai, slightly increasing the bonuses to Hillcorp employees, but it's not helping the state of Alaska. So they're just not helping. Mike?
Is it proper to say that oil and tax credits, you can also say SB 21? Because the SB 21 is what, my understanding is where a lot of this came from. We voted on it as Alaskans, we voted to maintain it, and now we're getting ready to turn around and say, okay, oh, so sorry, you guys did your models, bigger on this. Now we're going to pull the rug out from underneath you. That's not giving the industries, that warm and fuzzy feeling that they don't have to worry about getting the rug pulled out of them we do something right one year and we pull the rug out on them the next year.
All right, so you've either been talking to Shelley or Kathy, right? Here's the real answer. This $775 million is not coming from SB 21. SB 21 changed the tax rates on production. So Arco, I'll show you how long I've been up here. ConocoPhillips, BP, Exxon are taxpayers, right? It changed all that SB 21 did was change the rate of tax they pay on the production.
Mm-hmm.
These are checks being cut from the treasury and going largely to small producers. The origin of these, there's two origins. One is ACES. And what happened during ACES, for those of you who were around at that time, was Sarah and the gang said, hey, we don't like relying just on the three big players. We want a bunch of small players to come in and compete with them. We want other people to come in and compete with them. So as part of ACES, they created this credit structure and created a payment system in the credits. And said, okay, if you come up here and drill, 2007, if you come up here and drill, we're going to pay you money. We're going to give you subsidies in order to do that. That's one part of where this money comes from. The second part is the Cook Inlet Recovery Act. And what we did in 2010, what Hawker did in 2010 was say, look, we're running short on gas, right? So in South Central. So we need to do something to spur discovery and to spur activity in the Cook Inlet. We're going to give you credits to go out and do things like bring rigs up and to go out and drill additional wells, and we're going to pay you to do that because we need additional gas supplies to avoid the shortages that we're fearing are coming to South Central. It was a success. Wave the flag. Say, we did it. By God, we no longer have concerns about shortages in South Central. Stop the credit program that went along with it now that we've had success. But we're continuing it. That's the source of these tax credits. They're entirely different than the SB 21 tax rates. So in response to Kathy and Shelley, and I told them that directly, so I can just tell you as well, no, they're not SB 21 related. They come from a different source. They've outlived their usefulness. They haven't produced a return. They haven't even recovered the costs associated with them. It's time for them to end.
So in other words, what you're saying is I was right when I was helping try hugging those guys say no to ACEs and AGEA.
Well, AGEA not so much. AGEA is something entirely, it goes back to ACEs and it goes back to the Cooking and Recovery Act. I'm going to hazard a guess it's about 50-50. I may be wrong about that between the source of the two, but these are not SB 21. We're not welshing on our SB 21 deal by undoing these credits. What we're doing is we're saying a program we established in 2007 and in 2010 no longer either is needed in the case of the Cooking and Recovery Act or no longer works in the case of the ACEs credits.
Okay, so a supplemental question then. Let's say we do what you're wanting us to do. Are we looking at lawsuits by the industry down the line for pulling the rug out from underneath us?
No. That's what the significance of the administration's July 1 or June 30, 2016 cutoff is. It says, if you were doing it up until June 30, 2016, when the law is in effect, we will pay you. That's what the transition fund is for. We will honor the obligations that you incurred. But we have the right to change the law, right? We have the right to change the credits that we're going to pay. We didn't tell you, we never told you there were going to be credits beyond any given date. We told you if you did this activity now, we would pay you credits. But we have the right to change the law going forward and say after that date, you no longer have credits. So the answer is no. You want me to tell Shelley and Kathy that also? Or?
Yes, please.
Speak slowly. Miranda.
So I have a question about spending and limits. Clearly the legislature doesn't have to look on the budget and keep it down.
Louder.
In 1982, there was a constitutional amendment that put a ceiling on spending.
Yeah.
It's been completely ineffective, a lot of it because the assumptions were wrong in the formulas. What are the options statutorily or through referendum to change that, to put it back to a sustainable number and tie it to current revenues and such?
So it would take it to change that constitutional provision would require a constitutional amendment. And you have to go through the constitutional amendment process to do that. You can do it by initiative or you can do it by a vote of 2/3 of the legislature to amend the Constitution and put it out to the people. The odds of doing that in any sort of timely fashion are not good.
Right.
And so what the sustainable budget approach is, what we've crafted is a statutory approach and put it into the budget bill as a way of enforcing it there.
Without the constitutional change though, because it's so much higher, statutorily you can put it under that and change it and restrict it without having to modify the original one. It just changes the assumptions that go into the formula that the Constitution has.
Yeah, so the Constitution provision is just irrelevant. I mean, it just doesn't work. It was a good idea at the time. It was Dave Donnelly's? Is that right?
Well, I did a lot of work on it. I tried to make it work,
It was a good idea at the time, but the assumptions that got built into it just didn't work, haven't withstood the test of time. So this wouldn't be, the sustainable budget approach wouldn't be a provision that would be trying to re-implement that in a different way. It would just sit out there as a separate statute. Just sort of let it drift off.
But why could you not enact what Scott's come up with, 4.5, that's all operating, correct?
No,
No. Okay.
Total.
Okay, 4.5, then otherwise I was going to go to 4, but 4.5 and enact it through legislation triggered by the passage of a constitutional amendment with the freezing, with a cap at that amount.
you could, but then you're still dependent on a constitutional vote.
Well, so what? The people.
You mean
Anything, in order to take the permit fund or take the earnings of it or anything else, pass the legislation, subject to this November, the citizens voted on a constitutional spending cap.
Yeah, that's sort of what Stoltz talked about at the beginning, sort of taking this.
Yeah, then he quit.
Well, he quit talking about it, and then he quit.
Yeah.
And there's not been a whole lot of enthusiasm for taking it to a vote of the people.
But there is no other way to cap the spending other than a vote of the people. It will never cap.
Well, then we're doomed.
That's the second part of the discussion.
Yeah.
How do we do that?
But the sustainable budget approach, putting that in statute, is the best way that we've got to move on this quickly. There's actually a bill that starts down that road. HB 311 right now is built as a information bill that the administration has to report to the legislature on what the sustainable number is, but it's easy to turn that into a spending cap bill along the way. Sharon?
When you were tutoring us and saying blanket statement that tax credits are bad, do you think tax credits tied to production are bad also?
Well, so there's two ways to talk about that. One is, in SB 21, we use this unfortunate term of tax credits as the ratchet to adjust rates. So that's good, because it's actually just a rate adjuster, right?
Mhm.
We're not cutting checks, giving it back to the industry.
Right.
It's just a rate adjuster.
But we
use the
also
word-
tied it to production.
All right, so so this is another.
So we're not giving them money
Right.
before they're putting any fluid in the pipe.
Right, which is essentially giving them an IOU that if you have production and if you bring production, that you then can take these credits against the obligation you otherwise have for the production.
Right.
Okay, there's two things about that. In concept, it's a good idea, but there's two things about that. We don't have significant taxes on new production right now. One of the pieces of SB 21 did lower the tax rate on new production. So you'd have to make sure they're actually going to be taxpayers. There's actually going to be revenue to count against it. You don't want to just give them a check when they have additional production. You want it to be an offset to an actual
Right.
tax obligation. So yes, we could do that, but we have to make sure they're taxpayers.
You don't
before we
think
do
it does that? If they couldn't get they can't go below zero. The legislation says that they can't go below zero.
You're talking about, so that's not the way this tax credit system works right now. This tax credit system is, you made an expenditure, even though you have no production, you made an expenditure, you can come to the state treasury window and get a check.
The old ones, yeah.
The old one. Okay, the old one, where it would be a credit against taxes otherwise due, yes, that would be fine. I think that would be fine. What producers will tell you is, but I can't get front-end financing then. What if I have a dry hole? I can't use these tax credits to go out and get financing because there's no certainty I'm going to get the tax credit. That's sort of the point. But they will tell you that it doesn't work as effectively as the system where we just cut them a check along the way. Sir?
Can you explain to me the rationale behind the statements and all the TV ads lately that unless we rob from the PFD, that it will disappear completely in 3 years?
Yeah, so it's this. Yep. It's this.
Yeah.
This is the predicate for that. This is the revenue number. This is all we're ever going to get.
Fear mongering.
This is where we're stuck at the revenue line. And if we have to fund this out of savings, we run out of savings. Pick your year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, pick a year. We're going to run out of savings, and so we'll no longer be able to pay the PFD because we're going to have to be using those savings to fund this deficit. So what you need to do is give us more revenue. We need to cut the PFD, and we need to have taxes to give us more revenue so we don't run out of savings. That's the basis for it. That revenue projection. And I think that revenue projection is wrong. That revenue projection, by the way, the current version of the revenue projection says in 2025 we're still not going to be back to $60 a barrel.
Where'd that come from?
Came from DNR or DOR.
Is that
So-
the same words that say the 120?
Let me show you what. So these are a bunch of price forecasts, right? The world IEA is essentially this blue line and green line, right? This is their projection of where we're going. This is an old EIA projection. This orange line is the fall revenue sources book projection, right? And it crossed $80 at 2022, okay? This is what they said in the fall was going to be the revenue line, right? Well, the problem with that was it sort of showed the deficit at not at the level they wanted it. So the spring revenue sources book, first time I've ever seen them do this, Sharon can correct me if I'm wrong, but first time I've ever seen them redo the entire price deck in a spring revenue sources book, which is just supposed to be the update from the fall revenue sources book. And usually affects 1 or 2 years. They changed the entire price deck of the revenue forecast and the spring revenue forecast. And now you only get to 60. I'm sorry, you do get to 60. You do get to $60. You get to $66 in 2025. The old one you had at $87. The fall one. These are only 3 months apart, 4 months apart. The fall one was $87 by 2025. The new one $66 by 2025. That's where that number's coming from. That, and assuming 5% production decline, not assuming no new fields are brought on, assuming no LNG. That's where that revenue line comes from.
And double population growth.
Population growth doesn't affect their number, so that's not a factor. Yeah.
My name's John Nelson. I'm a financial advisor. 3 years ago, I was following an oil analyst who projected the target for oil at $25 a barrel within 5 years. We see that now. I remember speaking to Bill Pop about that, and his eyes got about as big around his quarters when I mentioned that to him. So we can't use a higher number to base a budget on because nobody has that crystal ball. If we felt, and I'm not going to give financial advice, but if we felt oil was going to be $80 a barrel, it'd be a great place to put money. I'm not willing to take that risk. Right now, we see oil projected at a baseline at $25 back in 2003. There is talk about oil still being at $45 a barrel by 2025. So if we took a conservative approach at $60 a barrel, that may still be high. My question is, how would that affect the $4.3 billion sustainable budget if that was the case?
So I've got a $60 case in here by 2020, which is $3.9 billion.
So there we go. That would be the baseline I would project by because that's a conservative budget.
Okay, I disagree with you.
That's fair.
And let me tell you why I disagree with you. What the analysts who do this every day, day in, day out, have sophisticated computer models to do, is they project supply and demand, right? Once Saudi stepped out and said we're no longer setting a price war, we went to supply and demand. We went to market economics. And when you look, supply is driven by really one thing, investment levels. Because investment results in wells, results in production.
Yes.
When you look at current investment levels, there's been a huge drop since the oil price drop began in 2014. I think Wood Mackenzie's last number was they've tracked something like 200 delayed projects. Oil investment levels in the North Sea are down 90% from what they were before the oil price drop. When you go through, as these guys do, when you go through and calculate the numbers, supply, which is driven by investment, is going to face a significant fall. And demand is not subject to the same constraints. So the question then becomes, this is more than you ever wanted to know, but the question then becomes, what's the marginal cost of supply? In a market economy, what's the marginal cost to add the supply, right? That should set the price. And the marginal cost of supply out there right now, given the demand drop-off, the amount of projects, the amount of supply you have to replace, marginal cost of supply is largely going to be driven by Canadian additional oil sands and by deep water drilling off Brazil, in the Gulf of Mexico, and elsewhere. Current price of that, current cost of that, is about $70. What happens in the oil industry, and again, this is more than you ever wanted to know, but what happens in the oil industry is once you start an investment cascade, that is, once people start making investments again, the cost of supply goes up because this limited number of drillers, and limited number of drilling rigs, and limited number of drilling supply services that you've got out there start getting more demand, and their price goes up. That drives the marginal cost of supply up. So that's a very simplistic explanation of what all these computer models are saying. But when you look at people like the International Energy Agency, you look at Tom Petrie of Petrie and Parkman down in Denver, who's one of the best at doing this. They're all talking about $80 by the end of 2020. And why I'm concerned about jumping to $60 or $40 and saying that's more conservative is because that leads you to PFD cuts and taxes. to sustain the, hang on a second.
Yeah, that's
To,
great.
to sustain the level of spending. So we're gonna hurt the Alaska economy because we're being over conservative about price forecasts. When, if we use the best information out there of price forecasts, we don't need to be taking those steps. We don't need to be hurting the Alaska economy.
So with that, if we still could be looking at an oversupply of oil even at $50 a barrel. And I am not one that's gonna try to argue for taking money from the permanent fund dividend or the earnings or putting on a state income tax. That would be absolutely detrimental. And in order to get a sustainable budget, we have to address cutting the budget, getting back to a zero-based budget for spending. We have to go back to the basics. The way the state fixes their budget, it's based on last year's spending, not what it costs to run a budget. But I guess my point is, when we're trying to over-project, go back and look at what we should do is learn from history, go back 5 years and look at what the real analysts were saying and see where they fell on that chart of yours. Because if they're coming in at $25 a barrel and we're seeing $45 a barrel, or it was up to 100, there's a huge disconnect. And I do agree with the fact that we have gone back to a fair market oil supply and pricing of oil, and it's highly manipulated.
Not really in the long term. Well, $45. If you want to predicate budgets on $45, then we're talking about cutting, and you don't want PFD cuts and taxes. Then we're talking about spending levels in the low $3 billion, maybe high $2 billion level, which you'll say is okay, but I can't even get them down to 4.5.
I agree with that. And we have to hold these guys accountable.
Well, you know, here's the deal, and Sharon will love this one. Here's the deal. In 2012, we had an election, right? We had senators who went out there and absolutely committed to a sustainable budget, right? They were going to have a sustainable budget come hell or high water. When the Republican senators met after the election, there were 3 priorities. Sharon, you'll remember what they are. Number 3 was, we're going to adopt a sustainable budget, right? My first meeting with Charlie Hughes after that, who then became Charlie Huggins, thank you. I know it's Charlie. It's Charlie Huggins. My first meeting with Charlie Huggins after that election was, I want you to talk about sustainable budgets, but you know it's going to take us some time to get there, right? And so we're going to have to transition down. Just don't hold us too much to that sustainable budget number. So when you talk about we need to do this, we need to predicate it on $40 oil, hold spending to $40 oil. Okay.
I don't want to predicate it on holding its spending to $40 in oil. It's taking the money that we've got and throwing it at projects that we don't have no business throwing money at. And using what you're talking about as a baseline for that.
I don't disagree with that, but we need, in my opinion, we need to be realistic about what oil prices are. We don't need to be hurting ourselves more than we need to, or over projecting doom and gloom. I think 4.5 is achievable if people would just hold to what they say they're going to do. 4.5 is achievable, and then maybe next year 4.3 or 4.1 is achievable. But we're having trouble right now getting to 4.5. Bill?
Thanks, Brad. Back to your slide 18 there. I just finished a class at the university. Professor Gunnar Knapp, who's the current head of ICER. Of course, he's retiring from that position. And in that class, he taught us that these DOR revenue estimates have been notoriously inaccurate.
Yep.
So maybe we can use these private sector figures as a better baseline to make these decisions instead of these government statisticians or something.
Here's my problem with the DOR forecast, okay? This is more than you ever want to know. But who's doing that? Mm-hmm. Department of Revenue, right? Who do they report to? Governor, right? The governors always have an agenda. I mean, Sean Parnell had an agenda. Frank Murkowski had an agenda. All governors have an agenda. And the DOR forecast, as much as they tell you that they're independently driven, I mean, that drop between the fall revenue forecast and the spring revenue forecast is unexplainable by anything other than tactics.
You pay for the survey or the study. You guide the results of the survey and the study.
Yeah. So I agree with you. You know, the production forecasts I mean, I didn't have the quote I thought I had up there, but Craig Richards, during testimony in February, I think, was asked about the production forecast, because then he was trying to sell the proposal to tie the permanent fund to royalties, right? So he wanted to oversell, or he wanted to talk about the fact that royalties weren't going to really be as small as they were going to be. And what Richard said in that testimony is, oh yeah, the DOR production forecast that we use, well, that's sort of the most conservative forecast we got, right? We think 50,000 barrels more than that forecast is very likely, and we think another 50,000 on top of that. You see the 120,000 sitting out there, and you see Mark Meyer's statement about that being realistic. I think they're thinking that that's a go. But they've not included that in the DOR forecast, and so you see these revenue numbers that are low against what I think using reasonable estimates they would be. Nick?
So, question about oil hedging. Do you think that oil hedging against that long-term spending curve that you're proposing, 4.5 plus inflation, makes sense? Is that something that we should be taking a look at the state level?
Yeah, not even the majors hedge all of their production. So you might want to hedge a portion of your production, but you wouldn't hedge all of your production. It's sort of an insurance policy in a way, and yeah, that might make some sense, but we don't control that many barrels where it really is something that I've spent a lot of time on. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. With the
I hope so.
Governor Walker's wanting to end these tax credits in July of 2016, why would the so-called conservatives be digging in their heels and saying, let's eliminate them by 2020? And can you speak more to what actually happened today and what the House rules were and what actually happened and how that affects all that?
Well, Mike told you what the defense is that's coming out of these representatives, and frankly, I think they believe it. They believe that these are tied to SB 21. SB 21 hasn't had enough time to work, and so we really shouldn't be rolling them back until we see if SB 21 works.
Well, let me ask,
No, let me finish this question, then you can go.
Okay.
What was the second part of the question?
Well, I was wondering what actually happened today in the House
Oh,
rules
okay.
and what was
All right,
talked about there.
so the House Resources produced a tax bill that barely cut anything at all. Then that went to House Finance. They cut a little bit more. And then House Finance took that bill to the floor, right?
Okay.
And they could not get 21 votes for that bill. They split all over the place. There were some who thought the credit should be higher, some who thought the credit should be lower, some who were concerned about the fiscal impact, some that were concerned about other things, and they couldn't get 21 votes to pass it. So what they finally did then, they tried it 3-4 times, finally, to get it through on the House floor. Finally rolled it back to rules and said, Craig Johnson's the chair of rules, and said, you mess with this, you see if you can come up with a compromise. And Craig produced today a working draft, the House Rules produced a working draft of what their proposed fix is. And basically what you see is a small move down. I could put it on this chart, and what you would see, this is the credit level without any adjustments. This is what House initially proposed, this is what Senate initially proposed. You could see a small move down. There's no move in 2017. You can see a small move down in 2018, a bigger move down in 2019, a bigger move in 2020, and then all you got from here, they stop it in 2020, and all you got from here on out is the accumulated stuff that you still are owing on the prior years. So they terminate it, but they terminate it 4 years later than the governor's proposed program. Mike.
Okay, two questions. One, my understanding was, when they passed SB 21, was that was to get rid of a lot of this oil tax credits from ACES. That's my understanding of what that was supposed to be all about, right?
That may have been your understanding.
Or am I completely off base?
You're off base.
Okay, so what was the intent of SB 21?
SB 20, so divide your mind into two pieces, right? There's tax rates on production, right? So when BP, I was about to say Arco again, when BP, ConocoPhillips, and Exxon produce something, there's tax rates on that production, right? And the problem with those tax rates is they were essentially taking more revenue from new investments than was occurring elsewhere in the world, and so the companies weren't investing here, they were investing someplace else. So SB 21 is mostly about adjusting those tax rates so that those tax rates are competitive with every place else in the world. Over here in a different planet are tax credits. And tax credits are payments made by the state to another set of producers. BP, ConocoPhillips, and Exxon aren't entitled to credits, right? They don't get payments by credits. They pay taxes. They don't get these checks. Over here on another planet is the tax credit system that's paying smaller producers to come up here to subsidize their drilling programs, right? Entirely different planet. ACE's really touched both planets. It established the tax credits and it set tax rates. SB 21 came in and changed the tax rates, didn't really touch the tax credits.
Okay.
Right?
Okay, I got a better handle on that. The second thing is then,
Tied some to
we've gotten the budget down to 4.5, but oil and gas credits bring it up to 5.2. Right?
Right?
Okay. So I guess the big question in my mind is when we look at our legislators and we've said and they have said that they were going to hold the line at 4.5, and they've done that. But this oil and tax credit one was not wasn't on their horizon when they talked about this, or we got someone that just flat out said, okay, well we're not going to talk about that and deal with it later.
Oh,
So I'm kind of getting that.
Boy, Mike, you really bought off on the Shelley Cathy show.
No, this isn't having to do with Shelley Cathy. This is what I've been seeing.
Oil and gas tax credits were in the March budget. They were in the March budget at 73 million. There was 73 million in there that went into the 4.5, right? They were in there. Now they're changing it. They're coming back in and saying, that's the wrong number, we want a different number. And oh, by the way, we missed it by a factor of 10.
Exactly.
Now we want 770 million as opposed to 73 million. This isn't a question of something that was floating out there, not done at the time they did everything else. And now they're saying, oh, well, we added in and we're sorry. They're changing a number they had in there. They're changing a number they voted on. When the budget was voted on and Shelley and Cathy went like, well, actually they hit the green light, right? When they hit the green light, they voted on 73 million. Now the question is whether they're going to change that to 770 million. Miranda.
Don't they have to? I mean, we owe that money.
No.
You can stop. We've got about an $800 million obligation, right? That's accrued. We got to deal with that. But the way that the governor proposed to do it was put that in a tree, saying we'll set up a transition fund and we'll pay out that $800 million. We owe it. We're not going to argue with it. We'll owe it. The question now is whether you stop it now or you keep the bleeding going.
It's a great
I
transition.
understand that.
Miranda.
So the question I have is based on the commodities markets. That's one of the difficulties that a lot of us have with oil revenue up down forecasting agendas. One of the things that the U.S. did when they switched off the gold standard was to get rid of some of the volatility in the commodities market. One of the things that I've heard in support of utilizing the permanent fund as an endowment is that it eliminates some of the volatility through that and changes it from commodities-based to asset-based. Do you think there's a way to ensure that the spending and protections of the permanent fund dividend in itself are in place without relying on volatility of oil and commodities to...
That's what the sustainable budget number does. It tries to calculate what the number is going through the commodity cycle ups and downs. And it's adjustable. I mean, the statute provides that you go back and look at it, and if LNG, which is a big chunk of the future revenue, isn't going to go, if everybody walks away from it, then you have to adjust this number to do something else. But you're still trying to look through the commodity cycle, right? You're not running up and down the hill with commodities. The governor does it. The governor says he gets to the same place, but he does it by taking the permanent fund dividend, right? He essentially says, I'm going to supplement revenues by taking the permanent fund dividend. And my problem with that is the impact on the Alaska economy of taking the permanent fund dividend out of the private economy, putting it over to the government economy.
I have one.
Sir.
Yeah. Just for a moment, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. By taking away the credits from the small producers, is that kind of helping in a roundabout way, helping the big three producers slow down their competition? Or am I seeing this wrong? Am I looking at this wrong?
I wouldn't look at it that way. I mean, the competition that Palin was talking about in 2007 was the competition for new leases, right?
Okay.
She wanted,
To open up Thompson's,
I'm sorry,
to get, the oil field, Point Thompson.
no, Point Thompson was locked in by old leases.
Okay,
So we're talking about new leases, right?
Okay.
We're talking about leases that hadn't been granted yet.
okay.
And the goal was to get competition for the new leases, right? So when BP competed with XYZ Oil Company in a lease bid, XYZ Oil Company knew it was going to get state support for its development program, so it could bid higher on that lease against BP, right? What's really happened since? I mean, that was the theory. That's the competition we wanted.
That's what I
right?
was trying to remember.
Okay. So what's happened since then is really the majors aren't competing for new leases.
Well, nobody's bidding on new leases.
Well, not right now, but even when there was oil prices were still high, BP wasn't competing on new leases. Exxon wasn't competing on new leases. Conoco was sort of, but it was really just to protect their flank around production areas that they had already developed. So that's why Great Bear and 88 Oil and all those people got all those new leases, because nobody was competing with them, and yet we're still subsidizing.
Okay.
So that theory that they had in 2007, that we needed to support the competition.
Leg up theory.
I don't think it's really played out.
Okay.
And
Let's
a
do
larger,
two more questions and we're about out of time here.
a larger picture is we've spent $3 billion to date. We haven't even got that money back, much less a return on that money. That money would have produced, if you would have put it in the PFD instead of in these programs.
I'm behind you on this one. I'm with you.
Okay. Yep.
Out of those three, sales tax, income tax, and money from the PFD, what's the most damaging to the whole economy?
PFD.
PFD is most damaging. And what's the least?
Sales tax.
Sales tax?
Well, actually stopping capital spending, state capital spending is the least damaging.
Yeah.
So stopping things like the oil and gas tax, for example, is the least damaging.
One more question. Last one. I'll ask. Ron?
This is not a question, it's just to confirm something, Brad, that you said earlier. Our Department of Revenue, and this is going back to the Parnell administration, they've had their head in the sand for 3 or 4 years. Barron's had a very good article about 3 years ago. And Texas and Louisiana were already, their crystal ball was much better than Alaska's. If you remember right, Texas and Louisiana were already projecting lower oil prices 3 years ago. Now their economy wasn't nearly as dependent as the state of Alaska. And I'm not a great Facebook poster, but I posted about 3 years ago, why on earth is Alaska's crystal ball not as accurate as Texas and Louisiana? They were already looking at how it was going to impact their state budget, and we kept our head buried in the sand. This was coming.
There are, I mean, the IEA, I think, is the best. Some people think the EIA, some people think other prognosticators are the best. I think the IEA's got the best computer program for trying to figure out supply, demand, and marginal cost of supply. And the IEA was doing that. It was showing a decline in oil prices back when Parnell's Department of Revenue was still forecasting high oil prices. And those states, frankly, they don't try to do to the same level we do their own prognostications. They look at independent third parties, estimates of oil prices. Back to my point, governors drive Department of Revenue forecasts.
Okay, last question and we'll wrap it up. $4.5 billion is a pretty much pre-agreed upon number, and that includes the oil and gas tax credits, includes everything. You're governor for a day, and you got to come up with a budget by the end of the week. How would you put that number into the $4.5 billion? What would you cut? Just give me 3 points where you think you're overfunded.
I've got a chart that does this sometimes because I don't have any.
Because,
three places.
Just to really preface this, one of my good friends was lobbying in Juneau a couple months ago. Walked into one of our senator's office on finance and said, "We need to cut this much," and the senator said, "Okay, where should I cut?" There was an awkward pause. I'm like, "Well, you're on you're on finance," and we hire these guys, we send them down there, and they're so terrified of the lobbyists beating them up that they're afraid to voice their own opinions. So here's your chance.
I answer this on Michael Dukes every week. Do a radio show with Dukes.
By the way, you had a great show this morning with him.
Thank you. So 3 places, right? Oil and gas tax credits. Big surprise to everybody in here, right? Cut them off at 2016. Don't extend them. Create the transition fund, sort of an off-books fund. Pay out what we owe, but don't continue spending any more on oil and gas tax credits. Medicaid. Half of Medicaid is roughly $650 million. Half of it is federally mandated programs, half of it is state optional programs. The state optional programs we've opted into over time. Sharon can probably speak to this better than I, but my perspective has been that we've opted into them because the concept has been, hey, if we spend 50% dollars on this, we get 50% from the feds. That's more money. Let's keep opting into these. Alaska has opted in. Alaska is the only state in the United States that's opted into every Medicaid optional services. Medicaid optional services. So that's about 300 million. If we cut, Arizona and Nevada both do the federally mandated program. They don't do any more than that. So if we cut back to the federally mandated programs, cut back to the Arizona Nevada plan, that's another $300 million. University system, so F1, that's oil and gas tax credits. Medicaid's number 2, university system's number 3. The Constitution says we shall have a university.
Right.
What do we have now? We got 3.
Yeah.
We got UAS, UAF, and UAA, right? We're trying to run 3 universities with 3 chancellors, with 3 sets of provosts, assistant
3
chancellors,
sets of books.
deans, 3 sets of books, 3 sets of faculty heads. The Constitution says 1 university. Cut back to university. The university system costs us plus or minus about $325 million. We probably can fund a single university for about 2/3 of that, if not less. That's another $150 million. Those 3 things get us below $4.5 billion. I can get there in those 3 steps.
Excellent. Thank you, Brad.
Excellent question.